When we look at this prayer, we remember that Christ is a technical term that is bigger than a person. It means literally anointed or anointing. And so this roominess that Patrick is speaking of, he's talking about the very presence of God, the incarnation of God with us, is all these things. This is incredibly inclusive and incredibly roomy. And this theology, which is behind this, was buried and really has stayed buried until very, very recently. Orthodoxy squashed Christianity into being a series of binary statements about, do you believe in this, do you believe in that? And this ever-present, inclusive, massive, in all of us understanding of God with usness is only now beginning to reemerge and seen for the light of day. If only we had the wherewithal to recognize that last line, Christ in mouth of friend and stranger, the presence of God with us in the mouth of friend and stranger. What a different world we would have. Let's say the whole prayer together, and then we'll move on. Christ be with me, Christ within me, Christ behind me, Christ before me, Christ beside me, Christ to win me, Christ to comfort and restore me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ in quiet, Christ in danger, Christ in hearts of all that love me, Christ in mouth of friend and stranger. That's a good prayer to start the day with. We are very fortunate to have with us one of our old dear friends, Sam Altis, who was on staff with us a couple years ago, and he let me know he was coming into town, and so I immediately extended the invitation if he would be willing to share his magical speaking skills with us today. And after some deep, intense struggle, he said yes, and so we're very glad for that. So he gets to pick up with our Atomic series in John 10. So please welcome Sam Altis.
Good morning. Magical speaking skills. I'm just going to do magic tricks for you. Hey, good morning. It's really good to be back with you and see a lot of familiar faces. Before we jump into the teaching, I'll give you like a 30-second life update. If we've never met, you can just like fall asleep for 30 seconds and wake back up. But yeah, so Kaylin and I were here for a year, and then we headed out to Tacoma, Washington, spent a year there for a fellowship she was doing. After that, ended up in Southern California, in Ventura. Thought that was gonna be like a permanent kind of thing. Life sometimes throws you some curveballs, and so we got a curveball. And ended up actually recently in Los Angeles instead. So back in January, Kaylin and I moved to LA, and she is in a great job there. She works for Conrep, which if you're familiar with the state hospital system, when folks leave the state hospital, they go to Conrep and they go to Kaylin. And so first 90 days out of a state hospital, she oversees that program. So she's a pretty big deal. I think I can say that. I'm embracing the LA lifestyle. I have auditioned for every Real Husband show that I can find, and there just hasn't been a good fit yet. I can't quite find my niche. That's not true, obviously. I am still actually managing remotely a program in the refugee resettlement world that manages church partnerships and recruits churches. Kind of a stopgap. I'm still finding my feet in LA, and we'll see what shakes out from there. So there you go. That's probably more than 30 seconds, but that's a life update. The rest of you who don't know me, you can jump back in right now. But let's jump into the series that Pete generously let me kind of get into, and we'll talk about John 10. But before we do that, I've got a question for you. And the question, I think, is actually what lies behind John 10. And it is, who do you trust? Who do you trust specifically when you think about someone giving you guidance about God and spirituality? Who do you follow in that? Now, the correct answer is obviously Pete Shaw, and so if you were thinking anything other than that, you're free to leave at this juncture. That's the opposite of what we're going for today. It's an important question, though. And if you have found your way to a safe space like CrossWalk and a generous space like CrossWalk, then it's probably a question you may have wrestled with before. I know it's one that I did. Maybe you've had in your past an experience where you trusted someone to lead you spiritually or guide you spiritually, and they led you down a path that wasn't helpful for you, or was maybe even harmful, or worst case scenario was even abusive. And so this question, who do we trust, is really important. And I think it's also really old. People have been asking this question for thousands and thousands of years. And I think it's the question that actually lies behind John 10, the passage that we're going to look at today. And underneath all of this, I think we may not find an exact answer, but we're going to find some wisdom and some guidance when it comes to that question. Who do we trust to help guide us spiritually, to connect us to God? Now, John 10 is a super long passage. It's 42 verses. I'm not going to read it all to you because it would probably kind of put you to sleep. But let me summarize it for you, and then we're going to look at some bits and pieces of it. So it's a long passage, but it's probably a familiar one to you. It goes something kind of like this. Jesus talks about himself as the Good Shepherd, one of our favorite metaphors for Jesus, or at least one of the most common metaphors for Jesus. And he says, I'm the Good Shepherd. I access my sheep through a pen and a gate. You know someone is a thief if they're jumping the fence instead of going through the gate. And he's talking to these religious leaders and these crowds, and they're like, we don't understand what you're saying. So he's like, okay, all right. I'm the gate now. I'm the gate. The sheep who follow me come and go through me in that gate, and they're led to pastures in life. And they're like, I thought you were the shepherd. Now you're the gate? What are you doing? And so he goes back and he's like, all right, no, I'm the Good Shepherd. I am the Good Shepherd because I'm willing to lay my life down for the sheep. I'm willing to sacrifice everything for them. And then the story actually changes scenes but keeps metaphors. And Jesus is all of a sudden at the temple at the time of Hanukkah. And these religious leaders are still talking to him. And they're like, all right, just be straight with us, all right? You're using all these metaphors. Just tell us who you are. And he's like, all right, I'll tell you. I've been telling you. I'm the Good Shepherd. And it's almost like at that point, they're just like, that is too much. And they pick up stones to stone him, not just because they're annoyed with him, but they think he's equating himself to God. And then he quotes this piece of old scripture at them that we'll look at in a second. And the whole situation kind of diffuses. So kind of this long, meandering story, but a story you've probably heard before in one form or another. Confession for you. I spent a lot of time just like looking at this story this week. And no offense to Jesus, but it's not a very well told story. Like Jesus probably wouldn't be a screenwriter or an author these days, which I think I can say. It doesn't really like flow very well. It doesn't go from point A to B. And then Jesus keeps changing metaphors, like, are you the shepherd? Are you the gate? What are you? It doesn't feel like there's a clear point to it. And then when he's asked direct questions about what he's saying, he just gets really dodgy. He's kind of like, let me use a different metaphor for you. And so people get really frustrated. The reason, though, that it may feel like a strange and maybe even not great story to us is because it's not made for our ears in our mind. It's an ancient type of story. It's an ancient Semitic story. Ancient Semitic stories didn't work the same way that our stories work now. Like, we like stories to be pretty clear, very little wasted dialogue, and you kind of know where they're headed. It kind of wraps up at the end nice and smoothly. Ancient Semitic stories didn't do that, though. What ancient Semitic stories would do is they would kind of wander around. They wouldn't go from point A to point B. And so you'd actually have to like soak in the story for a while. And they'd have layers. They wouldn't always have one point. And so you'd find one thing and you'd be like, that's amazing. And then you turn over here and you find something else and it's also amazing. And often what would happen in these stories is you would enter one way with one set of assumptions, one set of beliefs, and then after you wander around in that story for a while, you actually leave it with a different set of assumptions, and you've picked some things up along the way. So for us to understand all this sheep and gate metaphor and all that sort of stuff, I want us to try to get in that kind of ancient mindset. I know it's hard to do, so put your iPhones away for a little while and get kind of ancient here with me for a second. But let's wander around the story. Let's look at different layers and different levels that it has and see what kind of pops up and bubbles up. Sound good? I ask that question to audiences all the time, but it doesn't really matter, like you're here. So let's start at the first level. The first level that it speaks to us at when we're thinking of that question, who should we trust spiritually, is a really basic evolutionary level. And that's who we should either run from or fight, that fight or flight mechanism in us. Who should we resist? Who is a dangerous spiritual leader? And so it starts with some of that. Check this verse out here. Before we even get to John 10, Jesus says this. He's just healed a blind man, and he's talking to these religious leaders. And he says, if you were blind, he's talking to these religious leaders, you wouldn't have any sin. But now that you say, we see, your sin remains. So he's pointing out, if you have a religious leader that thinks they've got it figured out when it comes to God, there's a pretty good chance they actually don't have it figured out when it comes to God. Now, Jesus was actually onto this social psychological principle. He probably didn't know it, but a principle called the Dunning-Kruger Effect. Anyone ever heard of this? It's kind of gained some popularity. The Dunning-Kruger Effect is this principle in psychology and sociology that the more you experience something, the more knowledge, the more comprehension, the more experience you have with something, the less confident generally you are that you know everything about it. And the inverse is true. If someone seems to think they know everything about a particular topic and they feel highly competent in it, it probably means they haven't actually gone very deep in that topic. And so what Jesus is saying is that's true in spirituality as well. If someone is trying to convince you that they know everything about God in life, then they probably haven't actually walked very deeply in it. And they may not be the person we want to trust with our spirituality. Let's keep going. After this, Jesus jumps into his sheep metaphor and says, I assure you that whoever doesn't enter into the sheep pen through the gate but climbs over the wall is a thief and an outlaw. Pretty harsh metaphor. This is almost like insultingly simple and straightforward, but I think it's still, at least for me, pretty profound. When it comes to thinking about who we trust spiritually to lead us, if it looks like someone's doing something shady, they're probably doing something shady. Like, that's what Jesus is saying. If someone is acting like a thief and they're jumping a fence, I mean, probably what's happening. We, in religious circles, oftentimes will not trust our gut on this kind of thing. We have a lot of reasons, and we convince ourselves, I've convinced myself previously, that when it looks like something kind of fishy is going on in a religious circle, that maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's not what's happening. Because first off, we give people the benefit of the doubt because we're talking about God. This should be a loving, good place. This specifically is a loving, good place. I'm not talking about CrossWalk, to be clear. And we give the benefit of the doubt, or maybe that spiritual leader has done something helpful and beneficial for us in the past. And so we give them a little credit and a little bit of leeway. Or maybe all of our friends and our family aren't seeing what we're seeing, and so it feels like we're the crazy ones. I actually kind of had this happen to some extent. When I was wrapping up seminary, Kaylin and I moved to Indianapolis, and I was looking for a full-time job, and I was referred to a job at a church partnership program, or like a church network. So it was this organization that connected all these churches. And I was referred for this job by a couple churches that I really respected. And so I went for this interview, and I sat down with the head of this organization, and it was the longest, strangest, most invasive interview I've ever been a part of. I think it lasted 2 to 3 hours, asked all these invasive questions, and by the end of it, I was like, this is weird. Like, I am not quite sure what's going on. And there were these red flags that kept popping up. First off, and this sounds really strange, the other staff members would call the head of their organization a prophet. It's like, excuse me, a what? Pete told me he actually wants that title, so if you can start calling him prophet, then I think he'd really appreciate it. So that was weird, but I was like, all right, but these churches I like are cool with this, so whatever. And then it became pretty clear he had no accountability, and he was pretty self-absorbed, maybe narcissistic. And so I thought at the end of the interview, I was like, this doesn't seem right. But then I sort of convinced myself it must be okay because all these other people that I respect are okay with this or aren't aware of it. Fortunately, I didn't get the job, so I didn't have to make the choice of whether to stay in that sort of environment or not. But lo and behold, 2 to 3 months later, it came out that this guy was everything that it appeared he was. He was abusive, narcissistic, and his entire sort of church network tragically collapsed because of this. And so I think we know sort of in our gut when something is off. And I think that's what Jesus is trying to wake us up to. If it feels like something's off, trust that sense. Let's keep going. One more point on this fight or flight who we shouldn't trust. And another harsh sort of metaphor by Jesus. He says, the thief enters to steal, kill, and destroy. Now that's like some really kind of over-the-top language. That stuff happens in church and spiritual circles, but that's not our bar for what's acceptable, you know? Like we shouldn't be like, well, they didn't steal, kill, or destroy, so I think Jesus is cool with it. What's behind this is Jesus, I think, is saying, if someone is willing to see you as expendable, they are not worth your trust. If they are willing to sacrifice you for whatever they're working on, then go somewhere else. And this often happens in spiritual circles. Oftentimes people will use and objectify and abuse people in church circles. Now, there can be a lot of reasons for this. Oftentimes, it can be malicious. The person could have terrible intentions. Oftentimes, it's because spiritual leaders and pastors haven't dealt with our own wounds and hurt. And then sometimes, folks are just trying to perpetuate systems or institutions, and they get so caught up in that people become expendable along the way. Now, let me be clear. Whatever the reason for this sort of thing, it's toxic and it's not deserving of our trust. So run away from it. And I think a place like CrossWalk is a great place to run. So that's the first kind of level or layer to these stories. It tells us who we shouldn't trust, who we should fight or flee from. Now, don't literally please fight bad spiritual leaders. Like, I'm not trying to get other pastors in Napa beat up. That's not the point of this. But that's the sort of first layer, who we should be cautious about. There's a second layer, though, and it speaks to our need to actually follow someone. Like, we need guidance when it comes to spirituality and life. And so what are the characteristics, what are the values, what are the sort of signposts for us to think about who we should be following? I think some of that wisdom bubbles up here. Check this out. Jesus was in the temple walking in the covered porch named for Solomon. That's straightforward, right? Like, leaders who like porches are worth your trust. No, that's not the point. This one's a little harder to get to. But what you got to understand is Solomon's porch was a part of the temple complex. And so the temple complex is where you would go to connect with people and learn about God. Solomon's porch was also the very last place in the temple complex where everyone was welcome. So if you got any farther into the temple, if you were a woman, if you weren't circumcised, if you were unclean, you couldn't go in. And so what I think is happening here, and what's easy to miss, is Jesus is putting himself in a place of inclusivity. Jesus is physically locating himself in a place where everyone has access. And so when we are looking at who we should trust spiritually, one of the key questions is how inclusive is this community, or how inclusive is this person? Because if it's not inclusive, if people are left out, if there are walls put up or barriers put up, they're probably not tapping into something sacred. They're probably tapping into something divisive. And so when we're thinking about who we should trust, inclusivity matters. Let's keep going a little farther here. Jesus says this when he is questioned by these religious leaders. This is the point of the story where they're getting sick of his metaphors, and they're like, just tell us, what are your qualifications? Are you the Christ? And he says this, if I don't do the works of my Father, don't believe me. Now, this is actually a pretty revolutionary thing for a leader to say. He's saying, look, you want to know titles and qualifications? At the end of the day, what matters is, am I real? Am I authentic? If I'm not, don't follow me. And so Jesus gives us this sort of like standard for thinking about who we should trust when it comes to spirituality. And a lot of it has to do with, are they authentic? Are they real? Do they invite us to hold them accountable? And if not, then maybe they're not worth following. And so this is a really beautiful, radical thing. One more point on who I think should follow and sort of the path that Jesus gives us here. And to me, this is kind of what it all boils down to, this next one. Jesus says, I came so that they could have life indeed, so that they could live life to the fullest. Jesus is saying that his ministry and even having people follow him is not the end itself. It's not the means itself. It's an end to another means. And that means is a big, beautiful, full, deeply connected life. And so when we are looking at who we should follow and the type of people we can trust when it comes to our spirituality, it's people who realize that they are just in service to something bigger. People who are connecting us to the sacred. This is why Jesus changes metaphors and says, I'm the shepherd. No, I'm also the gate. He says these people come and go through me so that they can have life and life abundantly. And so, not to oversimplify it, but I think if we have to boil it down to sort of one question about who we should be trusting when it comes to our spirituality, at the end of the day, are they connecting us to God, to the sacred? If it's anything less than that, then it's probably not worth our time or our trust. Now, two layers here. First, the who we shouldn't trust, and then we see this sort of, I think, beautiful model or example that Jesus puts out. This is normally where we kind of stop in church when it comes to that question, who should we trust? Because it's the church answer, like, who should we trust? Jesus. You'll get there, it's fine. Pete, what is happening? We normally just stop at Jesus. We say, trust Jesus, trust this, and that is 100% true. I'm not saying that's not true. I'm not telling you not to trust Jesus, just to be clear. But there's another layer, and there's a layer that, to me, is even more surprising and empowering. See, what Jesus was saying was infuriating these religious leaders and these crowds. And they were really upset, it seems like in the story, because it looks like he's trying to take their power from them and call them out as bad leaders. But what we actually find out if we look a little deeper into these stories and these metaphors is if he's trying to take their power, he's only trying to take it so that he can give it to everyone else. And what we find when we look at this question, who should we trust? The answer is actually pretty surprising. Check out these next couple verses that are very similar to each other. Jesus, going back to his shepherd metaphor, says, whenever he has gathered all of his sheep, he goes before them and they follow him because they know his voice. Then he says something very similar on the next slide here. He says, I know my own sheep and they know me just as the Father knows me and I know the Father. Jesus is saying he is worth following and people follow him because they know him. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think about knowledge, I think about the kind of knowledge I was raised with, like testable knowledge. Can I pass a test? I know certain facts about history, about the Bible, those kind of things. That's not what this knowledge is. In the ancient world, knowledge wasn't about just what was sitting up here. Knowledge was experiential. Knowledge was mystical. It was this deep sense of knowing. So it meant taking your experience very, very seriously. And so what Jesus is saying here is pretty radical. He's saying, the reason people follow me is because they're taking their experience seriously. And he's almost suggesting that when we ask that question, who do I trust when it comes to spirituality? He's saying, trust yourself. Trust your experience. Trust what has brought you here. which is a pretty radical thing to say. Now, I've actually found this pretty true if I zoom out and look at my own life and the scope of my own spiritual life. My spirituality has changed really drastically. Kaylin can tell you that. When we got married, I was a much different person spiritually. Even if we look at the things we said to each other spiritually, it's very cringeworthy and hard to go back and look at. I was raised pretty fundamentalist, pretty evangelical. But if I think about it, every significant religious experience I've had all has the same sort of truth or reality at its core. And I could probably boil it down to one of two things: a deep sense of love and a deep awe. Now, there were times where I sort of falsely accepted the limits of those things because someone sort of told me that there were limits to love and to awe. But if I get down to it, at the end of the day, I think I always knew for me what it was about, what was really sacred. And the pieces and the trappings of my faith have changed over time. But when I got down to it, I knew, and I think you know as well. So when it comes down to who you trust, Jesus is trying to say, trust you. As a friend of mine puts it, we spend a lot of time in church talking about how much we trust God. But if you look at what's happening in the stories of Scripture, oftentimes God is trying to show how much God trusts us and wants us to take that really seriously. This is a pretty radical idea. Now, Jesus actually goes further to a point that almost makes me uncomfortable, and he says this kind of strange thing next. Let me give you the context before we get here. So, Jesus is about to get stoned. People are picking up stones, and they're about to throw them at him and kill him because they think he is equating himself to God. And so, Jesus is facing death. He says this. Jesus replied, "Isn't it written in your law, I have said you are gods? Scripture calls those to whom God's word came gods." So it may be a little ambiguous here. When Jesus is about to get stoned and he's being accused of equating himself to God, he quotes Psalm 82:6. And it says this. Let me actually read it to you to make sure I get it right. Psalm 82:6 says, "You are gods. You are all sons of the Most High." So it's almost like Jesus is saying, if you're going to stone me, look at your own scriptures, and you better stone everyone else, because everyone else is also called a son of the Most High, a small g God in scriptures. Now that's borderline heretical, if I'm going to be honest. It makes you a little uncomfortable maybe. But it's almost like Jesus is trying to shock us into taking seriously our own connection to God. That he's saying, look, the same connection, the same access that I have to God, you also have that access. Stop deferring to spiritual authorities. If God is truly present and pervasive, and that Christ spirit that we talked about in that prayer is actually everywhere in the world, then you have just as much access to it as someone who has a PhD in religion, as a priest or a monk or a pastor or anyone. And Jesus almost has to shock us into that by calling us small g gods. Now, please don't go around calling yourself a god. That is not going to play well in any situation, and don't start a cult or anything along those lines. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you have a divine connection to God. Now, there's another side to this that I think is important. One more thing in here. Jesus earlier says this. He says, "I have other sheep that don't belong to this sheep pen." So right when our heads are kind of getting big, we're like, oh, Jesus called me a god. Then he says, also though, I've got other sheep everywhere. And so it's almost like he's saying, take your connection to God deeply seriously. When you're thinking about who you trust spiritually, trust yourself. But that also doesn't mean that you are the expert, because there's a lot of other sheep and a lot of other pens out there. And so we hold these two things together. That we're not deferring to spiritual authority when we think about who we can trust, but we're also not getting so inflated with our own importance that we think we are the spiritual authority. And what happens is there's this sort of divine give and take, where we realize that you have a connection and a perspective on God and the divine that no one else has. So much so that Jesus is trying to shock us into realizing that. But so does the person next to you, and the person next to them. in the person in the synagogue down the road, in the atheist in Berkeley, in every other person around you. And so you take your connection to God very seriously, but then you also take the other connections of other people to God. And we come together in spaces like this, in spaces like dinner tables and coffee shops and vineyards, sports games even, dare I say, and other places where we bring those connections together. And I think we begin to experience something that Jesus was pointing us to all along. That is life at its fullest. A deeply rooted, divinely connected life together. And that's what I hope for you. That's what I hope for me. That's what I hope for all of us. So will you pray with me as we finish up here? God, we are grateful for, or I'm grateful for ancient, meandering, strange stories that start with identifying our wounds and our pains and the things that we've had done to us, and hopefully end with us realizing that we are deeply connected. May we live into that connection. May we be deeply aware of that connection and not defer to others for our spiritual insights, but also to learn from others at the same time. Thanks. Amen.
Hey, to close today, let's stand on our feet, and I thought on this particular day, an Irish blessing seems to be appropriate. So why don't we say this out loud together, and if possible, sort of to each other, as you can imagine that. Let's do it together. May the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face. The rain fall soft upon your fields, and until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. Very good. One quick thing, I forgot to say this. Quick shout out. Sam has a great podcast that he does called A Better Story. He interviews really interesting people, theologians, authors of all ranks, and I really highly recommend you subscribe to that. It's really, really good. So anyway, shout out for him. All right, thanks for coming, folks. See you next week.